There are days when the soul feels so distant from the life that is happening around it that everything seems to lose its weight, color, and meaning. The laughter of others seems like a distant echo. Responsibilities continue, but motivation disappears. And in the silence between one task and another, there is an emptiness that screams, a feeling that is difficult to explain, but impossible to ignore. A loneliness that is not just physical, it is existential. An absence so profound that even faith itself seems to have drifted away. But what if this loneliness is not a mistake? What if this emptiness that hurts so much is, in fact, a language, a spiritual calling? Because there are silences that are not punishments, they are portals. Moments when everything fails on the outside so that, finally, you turn to what sustains you inside. The invisible, the eternal, that which has never left you, but which can only be heard when the world is silent. Napoleon Hill lived this moment with all intensity. He, who had dedicated his life to studying the laws of success, found himself facing a total collapse. Financial, emotional, spiritual, and it was in this abyss that a phrase became the center of his reconstruction. Fear only exists where God has been forgotten. This phrase was not just a rational conclusion. It was a vibrational reunion, a truth that emerged not from theory, but from pain. We live in a time when we are always surrounded by stimuli, but inside, many remain spiritually orphaned, lost among tasks, goals, and achievements that do not fulfill. And when the results do not arrive, the mind creates a cruel illusion that the meaning has also been lost, as if external failure were a sign of divine abandonment. As if God had gone silent when, in fact, it is the soul that has stopped listening. There is a presence that does not depend on belief, a presence that cannot be explained with words, but is felt with the body, an intelligent presence, vibrational, capable of reordering everything within you without making a noise. It is what many call God, but which can be recognized as that which manifests itself in every true action. As Ralph Waldo Emerson said, not a distant being, but the unique spirit that lives in each moment of truth. And it is precisely in the moments when everything seems absent that this presence reveals itself. When there are no more masks to sustain, nor distractions to escape, when the noise stops, when the ground disappears, when the ego gives up, that is when the realignment begins. The rapprochement, the return to the essence. Because rock bottom is often the only place where the sky becomes visible. This video is an invitation to look at these moments with different eyes, to recognize loneliness, failure, and silence as portals of vibrational expansion. They are not the end. They are the crossing, a space where you stop looking for God outside and begin to find Him within, not as a belief, but as a frequency, as a living truth, as the point of origin of all healing, of all answers, of all creation. And maybe, just maybe, the absence you feel now is the exact space where God is about to reveal Himself, not as an external miracle, but as a light that has always been lit within you, even when everything seemed dark, because the invisible, when everything fails, is the only ground that remains. And this ground silently begins to support you, now, in this moment, in the exact place where you are. The invisible pain of those who try to fill the silence with productivity. It's easy to hide behind a busy schedule, with goals that multiply, with tasks that overlap. The world values those who are always busy, those who don't stop, those who deliver, respond, produce. But there is a silent pain behind this constant movement, a pain that few can name, but many feel. It is the pain of an emptiness that cannot be filled with activity, an internal silence that no amount of activity can completely drown out. When the soul is disconnected, the body can continue to move, but this movement is mechanical, automatic, an unconscious attempt to escape one's own presence. And the more one tries to do, the less one feels. What seems like productivity is often just escape. A desperate effort not to face the echo of the emptiness that hides behind the noise of routine. Absent presence is an increasingly common state. You are there, but you are not. You do what is necessary. You respond to what is asked. But inside, something does not connect. Something does not vibrate. It's as if you were living on autopilot in a life that no longer feels like yours. As if you were following a script without a soul, without a pulse, without truth. And this disconnection is not superficial. It has spiritual roots. Because when the connection with the source is lost, we also lose direction. We start to seek meaning in external achievements, in recognition, in results. But what is external can never fill that which only the internal sustains. And the more we try to resolve the void with productivity, the further away we are from healing. True productivity is not doing more. It is doing with presence. It is acting with body and soul aligned. It is allowing each action to originate from an internal place of clarity and connection. But this is only possible when there is courage to stop, to be silent, to listen to what is alive inside, even if it hurts, even if it confronts, even if it dismantles certainties. Emptiness is not the enemy. It is a portal, a call from the soul to return to what matters. To remember that, behind all the rush, there is a presence waiting to be felt. A presence that requires no effort, just space, just openness, just truth. And it is in this space that the reunion begins, not with big external changes, but with a small internal gesture, the gesture of coming back to oneself, of pausing, of breathing, of feeling. Because when silence is faced with presence, it ceases to be absence and becomes the bridge to reconnection, a reconnection that requires nothing more from you, just that you are whole, true, present. God as a frequency of alignment, not as religious dogma. For a long time, we were taught to see God as something separate from us, a distant being who lives in a distant sky and observes everything from above, judging what is right or wrong. For many, this image created more fear than love, more distance than connection. But there is another way to perceive the divine, a way that does not require empty rituals or blind obedience, a way that is felt, not explained, that is lived, not debated, that manifests itself as a frequency. God is the frequency of alignment, alignment between what you feel, what you think, and what you vibrate. He cannot be reduced to dogmas, names, or images. He is the intelligence that permeates everything that is alive, the presence that reveals itself when there is truth in the heart, the energy that sustains creation, even when everything seems to be falling apart on the outside. God is not a concept. God is a presence, a vibration that activates when the soul stops resisting. Napoleon Hill understood this not through theory, but through experience. In one of the most difficult moments of his journey, when everything seemed lost, he did not seek solace in religious discourses. He sought a practical faith, silent, living, a faith that did not require external proof, but rather an internal decision. He learned from Andrew Carnegie that the greatest achievers were not the most capable, but those most connected to this silent frequency, to this force that acts even when logic says nothing will work. And this force does not respond to memorized words. It responds to vibrational surrender, to coherence, to clear intention, to the willingness to trust even without seeing, to continue even without results, to sustain the field even in chaos. This is true faith, not the faith that expects miracles, but the faith that becomes the miracle itself, that vibrates the miracle before it manifests, that keeps the heart open when everything around it closes. God as frequency is God present. It is the silence that calms, the intuition that guides, the courage that arises from nothing, the relief that comes without explanation. It is that strength that holds you in moments when no one else seems to hold you. And it is in this state of connection that things begin to reorganize themselves, not by magic, but by resonance, because reality always responds to what you vibrate with truth. You can call this frequency God, universe, source, consciousness. The name doesn't matter. What matters is the internal state. What matters is if, when you pronounce this name, something in you becomes silent, something in you aligns, Something in you reminds you that you are never alone, because this presence lives within you. It has always lived, and it is just waiting for you to stop looking outside so that it can reveal itself from within, with gentleness, with strength, with love. The fatal error of seeking spiritual validation in results. There is a very deep human desire to be rewarded for faith, to see signs, to feel that prayer has had an effect, to realize that by trusting, something outside has also moved. And often when this does not happen, the soul becomes silent, not because it has completely lost faith, but because it has begun to associate spirituality with transaction, as if it were possible to negotiate with the divine, as if God owed us something in exchange for what we feel, think, or do. This is one of the most subtle traps of the spiritual journey. The idea that if I am aligned, everything should flow. If I trust, everything should manifest. If I vibrate love, nothing should go wrong. But this expectation turns faith into currency. It turns spiritual practice into a contract. And when the results do not appear, the heart closes, the connection cools, trust becomes demand, and everything that should heal begins to hurt. Napoleon Hill faced this dilemma profoundly. For years of his life, even aligned with a clear purpose, he saw no fruit. He wrote, trusted, visualized, and still the results were slow. He could have given up. He could have concluded that everything was wrong. But he understood something that many forget. Trusting in God does not mean expecting everything to happen as planned. Trusting is maintaining the vibration even when nothing happens on the outside. It is sustaining the flame when everything is dark. It is loving the invisible for what it is, not for what it can deliver. True spirituality does not reveal itself on easy days. It manifests itself in absence, in silence, in the time between the seed and the fruit. It is there that the vibration is tested. It is there that faith ceases to be theory and becomes living substance. It is there that the ego is dissolved and the spirit emerges with greater clarity. And when this happens, you realize that the greatest gift was never the result. It was the transformation that happened within you while it was waiting. When you transform your spiritual connection into a transaction, you move away from the essence. Because God is not here to fulfill expectations. God is the presence that sustains even when everything falls apart. The frequency that calms when nothing is resolved. The love that remains even when there is no return. And this love is what heals, not because it changes the world immediately, but because it changes what you emanate. And what you emanate changes everything over time. Stopping seeking validation in results is not conforming. It is transcending. It is leaving the logic of deserving and entering the consciousness of presence. Because when you vibrate love by loving, faith by feeling, surrender by trusting, you become free. Free from pressure, free from rushing, free from control. And in this freedom, you discover that the greatest manifestation is not in what happens. It is in who you become by remaining in God, even when nothing around you moves. And this state is enough. It is peace. It is fulfillment. It is the true reward. The cycle of manifestation begins with withdrawal. There is a moment, almost always ignored, that precedes every true manifestation, a space between desire and event. This space is withdrawal, not as an escape, but as vibrational preparation. A withdrawal that silences external noise to amplify internal listening. That slows down steps to realign direction. That takes our eyes off the world to look inward. Because every authentic manifestation begins with a pause where the soul reorganizes itself. In the rush for results, many forget that the invisible needs silence to be felt, that the new needs space to be born. That insight does not shout, it whispers. And to hear this whisper, we need to withdraw, return to our own center. Let the mind slow down. Let the body breathe slowly. Let the energy settle like dust that slowly returns to the ground. It is in this withdrawal that the frequency is refined, that intuition is revealed, that alignment happens. Modern neuroscience calls this state the brain's default mode, a state in which, apparently, we are doing nothing, but internally, we are connecting ideas, accessing memories, reorganizing senses. It is when the mind relaxes that the greatest insights emerge. It is in silence that the paths reveal themselves. It is in the absence of action that the next action becomes clear. And this process is not mental. It is vibrational. It is spiritual. There is a silent practice that can be cultivated in these moments. A simple and profound technique. Directed silence. Unlike empty silence, this is a silence with intention. You sit, breathe, and allow your attention to turn inward. No expectations, no rush, just presence, just listening. And little by little, what was blurry begins to reveal itself. What seemed confusing becomes organized. What hurt softens. Because silence, when embraced with intention, becomes a channel between you and that which has not yet manifested. Napoleon Hill understood this process intuitively. He knew that before any great accomplishment, there was a period of withdrawal, of diving, of solitude. And it was during these periods that he wrote the words that changed so many lives. Words that did not come from an anxious mind, but from an aligned soul, from fertile silence, from the vibrational space where manifestation is gestated before being born into the world. Retreat is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of wisdom. It is the recognition that everything that is real begins within, that the most powerful action is that which is born from a heart at peace, that the most precise movement is that which is guided by deep listening. And this listening only happens when you decide to stop, to breathe, and to trust that the invisible is working within you, even when nothing seems to be happening. In this sacred cycle, retreat is the first step. It is the beginning of everything. It is the soil where the new vibration begins to take root. And once it is rooted, it flourishes at the right time, at the right pace, on the right path. Because what is born from silence has the strength to remain. It has roots. It has truth. And that is exactly what you are creating now. Even if you do not see it yet, even though it still seems dark, the cycle has already begun. And it began in retreat, the absence of movement as a sign of spiritual realignment. Not all silence is absence. Not all pauses are failures. Not all moments of stillness are stagnation. There are periods in life when everything seems suspended. Nothing happens as planned. Plans don't move forward. Answers don't come. Doors don't open. And the immediate impulse is to try to force the flow, to push reality with the force of anxiety. But there is something deeper happening in this state of apparent stillness. Something that cannot be seen with the eyes, but felt with the soul. When life slows down, it is often because something inside you is being reconfigured. It is like the soil before the harvest, invisible but fertile. Silent, but full of power. There is a time to plant, a time to harvest, and a time to be silent. A time when one's own vibration adjusts, when the root strengthens, when the energy prepares for something that cannot yet be revealed. And this time is sacred, even if it seems empty. True spirituality recognizes that pause is not the opposite of progress. It is part of the process. It is in retreat that we hear better. It is in stillness that we feel deeper. It is in the absence of movement that we perceive what was escaping in the noise. And often, it is precisely this pause that prevents you from continuing a cycle that no longer serves you, that protects you from making a hasty decision, that aligns you with a frequency that is still adjusting within. The metaphor of fertile soil explains this process well. Before a tree blossoms, its roots go deep. Before a plant sprouts, the seed remains in the dark for days, weeks, or even months, with no evidence that anything is changing. But inside, everything is transformed. The shell breaks, the internal structure develops, and only then, in due time, does life emerge. The same is true for you. When nothing seems to move on the outside, something is being realigned on the inside. The absence of movement is not punishment. It is containment. It is the universe preventing actions that would arise from haste, fear, and incoherence. It is divine intelligence repositioning you, clearing the way, preparing the field, and at the same time, teaching you to trust without control, to feel without answers, to remain present even without evidence. Napoleon Hill went through this time, and instead of resisting, he learned to observe, to trust in the invisible, to use the pause as an opportunity for deepening, because he knew that what seems like absence today may be exactly what gives support to what comes next. This perception transforms everything. It takes away the weight of the pressure, it dissolves anxiety, and it reveals that the pause is not wasted time. It is time planted, and everything that is planted in silence flourishes with more strength, because it grows with roots, with purpose, with alignment. And when the movement returns, because it will return, you will be ready, not because you did more, but because you allowed yourself to be whole, to be real, to be receptive to what life wants to deliver, and not just to what you tried to force. The pause is sacred, and whoever learns to inhabit it consciously will never feel lost in it again. The invisible force that sustains faith when the mind fails. There are times when positive thinking is not enough, when repeating affirmations seems useless, when even the words of prayer lose their sound, their strength, their meaning. At such times, the mind can no longer sustain faith. It is tired, saturated, confused, and that is when something deeper needs to emerge. Something that does not depend on effort, something that does not require clarity, nor strength, nor optimism, only surrender. Only an open silence where the divine can still dwell, even when everything within you is about to collapse. Napoleon Hill knew this state, a period that he himself called his lost year, a time when there was no income, no support, no apparent direction. He lived on donations, on small gestures of help from people who believed in him even when he had nothing left to offer. And yet, in this apparent helplessness, he did not abandon his vision. He kept writing. He continued to sustain, with what little he had left, the flame of what he believed to be his mission. This support did not come from logic. It came from an invisible force, a force that acts when the mind gives up, that holds inside what no longer has form on the outside, a vibration that you do not produce, but that runs through you when everything else fails. This is the moment when true faith happens, not the faith that feeds on results, but the faith that feeds on presence, on a silent knowledge that says, even if I do not see, even if I do not understand, I am not alone. This invisible force does not need to be understood. It only needs to be felt. And you feel it when, even without knowing how, you can still breathe calmly. When, even without answers, there is still something inside you that prevents you from giving up completely. When, even in silence, there is still a subtle reminder that all of this has a purpose, that this dark journey is not the end. It is preparation. It is the gestation of something that has not yet been revealed. The mind fails, but the soul remembers. It remembers what was promised before you forgot. It remembers the path, even when the map disappears. It remembers the light, even in the midst of darkness. And it is this memory that sustains you, that holds you, that keeps you from falling completely, even when it seems like you have fallen, because there is a deeper ground than the ground of logic. It is the ground of the invisible, the ground of presence, the ground of God. Sustaining faith when everything is fine is natural, but sustaining it when everything seems to be falling apart is transcendence. It is when you discover that faith is not something you do. It is something that lives within you, that is born within you, that is reborn when the mind can no longer create hope. Hope, then, comes from the spirit. It comes from a place that fear cannot reach. And it is this place that holds you, that lifts you up, that carries you, even when you no longer know how to walk. The danger of spiritualizing escape. At certain points in our journey, it is tempting to use spirituality as an emotional refuge, a shelter where we avoid discomfort, deny pain, and postpone confrontation. Phrases like, God will provide, everything has a purpose, or It's the universe at work, can serve as comforting cloaks, but they can also be disguises, sophisticated ways of escaping vibrational responsibility, of masking fear, of avoiding decisions that require presence, courage, and real transformation. Spirituality becomes an escape when it stops being a living practice and becomes an idealization. When you start waiting for the divine to resolve what has been entrusted to your conscious action, when you use lofty concepts to justify inertia, denial, or passivity, this is not authentic surrender. This is silent abdication. It is placing on God's shoulders what your soul was called to move with intention. There is a very fine line between trusting and hiding. To trust is to vibrate in peace, even in the face of chaos. To run away is to numb yourself with beautiful words while your soul cries out for change. To trust is to remain open, even without answers. To run away is to repeat mantras without feeling what they really mean. To trust is to accept that there are things beyond your control. To run away is to abandon what is under your responsibility, hoping that a miracle will solve it. True spirituality, the kind that transforms, does not exempt us from the process. It calls us to the center of the process. It strengthens us to go through pain, not to avoid it. It empowers us to act consciously, even when everything seems uncertain. And more than that, it shows us that God is not a crutch. God is inner strength, active presence, vibration that walks with you, not for you. Napoleon Hill understood this in his moments of greatest trial. He could have waited for divine intervention. He could have resigned himself to failure, but he chose to continue. He chose to sustain the vibrational field with inspired action. He chose to move even when everything said there was no way. And it was in this movement that grace manifested itself, not as an escape, but as a response to the vibration he decided to sustain. Authentic surrender is not inertia. It is vibrational surrender accompanied by internal alignment. It is trusting in the invisible while moving in the visible with presence. It is knowing that God acts, but that your vibration is the invitation for this action. Running away may seem more comfortable, but only true surrender sets you free, because it does not distance you from the pain. It pierces you with light. And where there is light, there is a transformation. Where there is transformation, there is truth. And where there is truth, God is already there, rewriting your loneliness as a divine letter. Loneliness, when accepted without judgment, reveals not only the absence of the other, but the presence of a space where something new can be written, where old narratives can be transformed, where pain, instead of being denied, becomes raw material for revelations. In this silent and sensitive space, it is possible to hear something beyond one's own thoughts, something that seems to come from outside, but that, in fact, has always been inside. A voice that whispers tenderly, "I am here," even when you don't feel it. Rewriting loneliness is recognizing that it carries messages, that it holds truths that are only revealed when the noise of the world stops, that there is an intelligence behind the apparent abandonment, an intelligence that orchestrates silences as bridges, as invitations, as preparation for deeper reunions. Not with others, but with one's own essence, with one's own purpose, with the most alive and forgotten part of oneself. Imagine for a moment that your pain could speak, that it sat before you and wrote a letter. What would it say? What questions would it ask? What memories would it bring to the surface? And now, imagine that this pain receives a response, not from outside, but from the source itself. A response written with love, without haste, without judgment. A letter that does not explain everything, but that welcomes everything. That does not solve things immediately, but that illuminates enough for you to take the next step. Writing in this state is not just expression, it is channeling. It is allowing what is pent up to find form. It is transforming anguish into a message, helplessness into language, uncertainty into prayer. When you write as if God were responding, something reorganizes. The weight lifts. The vibration changes. And your own writing becomes a bridge between you and this presence that seemed absent, but that in fact was waiting to be called upon with truth. Napoleon Hill did not use letters, but he used words as a form of spiritual sustenance. He wrote so as not to forget. He wrote to keep the flame of connection alive. He wrote to listen to himself when no one else would. And in those words he found presence. He found direction. He found faith where there was only doubt. You can also transform your solitude into a letter without rushing, without a fixed form, a letter where you allow yourself to be, to feel, to reveal, and to receive an answer that will not come with logic, but with vibration, that will not bring all the solutions, but will bring a thread of light, a thread of meaning, a thread that reminds you your pain is not the end. It is just the beginning of a new conversation with the divine. And every true conversation transforms, because where there is listening, there is a response. And where there is a response, there is a path. And where there is a path, God is already there. The paradox of enough. There is a silent contradiction that many people live without realizing. On one hand, the desire for something more peace, more love, more clarity, more meaning. On the other, a deep tiredness of always feeling that something is missing, that it is still not enough. That one is not enough. And this constant search, this feeling of emotional, spiritual, or material scarcity creates an invisible anxiety, a state of perpetual waiting, as if true life were always one step ahead. But what if what you are looking for is not absence? What if it is excess of expectation? What if true sufficiency is not in having everything, but in feeling that, even in the midst of what is missing, something essential remains? The paradox of enough is this. It is discovering that when everything seems to be missing, that is exactly when spiritual sufficiency reveals itself. Not as conformity, but as alignment. Not as resignation, but as clarity. God is enough, not because He solves everything, but because in His presence, you reconnect with the part of yourself that does not need to prove anything, that you don't need to fill any void in a hurry, that you don't need applause to feel valued, that you don't need certainty to trust. This part is silent, but it is firm, and when it emerges, you realize that peace doesn't come from what arrives. It comes from what awakens within. Spiritual sufficiency doesn't eliminate desire. It purifies intention. It aligns wanting with the vibration of presence. It transforms, I need this to be happy, into, I am at peace now and open to more. It changes the root of creation, no longer based on lack, but on completeness, no longer driven by need, but by coherence. Napoleon Hill, in his darkest journey, understood this. He never stopped wanting to live a prosperous life, to serve, to make an impact. But something inside him changed. Desire stopped being an attempt to fill a hole, and it became an expression of an essence that already felt connected. From that state, everything that came after was not an achievement. It was a consequence. When you vibrate from sufficiency, the world ceases to be a place of testing. It becomes a field of manifestation. Life ceases to be a race and becomes a path. The search ceases to be a compulsion and becomes an expression of what already is, because you remember who you are when you are connected, when you are anchored, when you are in God. And in this state, even what is missing becomes space. Even what hurts becomes a portal. Even what has not arrived yet no longer weighs so much, because your vibration is no longer in waiting, it is in presence. And presence, when real, is enough. It always has been, even when you have forgotten. Even when everything seemed distant, even when nothing made sense anymore. In this moment, now, if you close your eyes, you can feel it. Presence is here, and it is enough. Hidden signs that your soul is asking for reconnection. Not all spiritual disconnection is revealed with words. Often it manifests itself in deep silences, in sensations that seem small but say a lot. A recurring insomnia that persists even when the body is exhausted. A tiredness that cannot be explained, even after long hours of rest. An unexpected emptiness that appears precisely after an achievement. A feeling of being lost, even when everything is, apparently, in place. These signs are not failures. They are vibrational alerts. They are ways that the soul finds to get your attention when the noise of the mind becomes louder than the voice of the spirit, when doing overrides feeling, when the connection with the source becomes distant, not by choice, but by forgetfulness. And in this forgetfulness, the body tries to remember, energy tries to communicate, life tries to whisper what you stopped hearing. The soul speaks through discomfort, not to punish, but to awaken. Every time you feel tired for no reason, there is something inside you asking for a break, asking for listening, asking for presence. Every time you achieve something and still feel that something essential is missing, there is a misalignment between what you do and what your soul wants to experience. And every time anxiety appears without warning, without cause, there is a part of you trying to return to the center. These signs are invitations. Invitations to slow down, to be silent, to stop looking outside and turn your eyes inward. And instead of judging these moments as weaknesses, it is possible to honor them as guides, as doors, as manifestations of a forgotten part of you that wants to be heard again. The soul does not turn away, but it becomes silent when you disconnect. And then it begins to send signals, small, persistent, symbolic. Napoleon Hill also experienced these symptoms. Moments when everything seemed tasteless, when the path seemed repetitive, soulless. He understood that discouragement, dispersion, doubt were signs that it was time to reconnect, not with a new goal, but with the presence, with the source, with that which gives meaning to everything you do. When you begin to interpret these signs as calls and not as problems, something changes. You stop fighting them and begin to dialogue with them. And in this dialogue, you rediscover the vibration of trust, the vibration of surrender, the vibration of sufficiency. Because every time the soul asks for reconnection, it is because it is ready to remind you of who you are. And this remembrance is the beginning of healing. It is the beginning of the journey. It is the place where God makes himself felt again, not as a concept, but as a living truth, pulsating in every gesture, in every breath, in every silence. God's sufficiency is not an end, it is a new beginning. When everything around you seems to be falling apart, when the ground disappears and hope hides in some unreachable corner of the soul, it is there that something sacred can finally emerge. Not as an answer, but as a presence. Not as an immediate solution, but as a silent reminder that what sustains you is not what you see, it is what vibrates. And what vibrates more deeply than anything else is the sufficiency of God. Knowing that God is sufficient does not mean that the pain goes away instantly. It does not mean that the answers arrive in the ego's own time. It does not mean that the voids disappear as if by magic. It simply means, and that is all, that even with the pain, even without answers, even with the emptiness, something inside you remains firm, because you know that you are not alone. Because you remember that there is a center that cannot be shaken, because you feel that even in the darkness, there is a gentle glow coming from within. Napoleon Hill called this spiritual seed time, a period in which everything seems silent, sterile, and confusing. But in truth, it is a time of preparation, of taking root, of invisible creation. And every crisis, when faced with faith, becomes the ground for reinvention. Not of the life you had, but of the life that could only be born from what was broken. Neville Goddard said, "Everything you need is within you, because you and God share the same creative substance." And when this truth is not only understood, but felt, you realize that nothing is truly lost, that everything can be remade, recreated, redefined. Because what sustains you is not what is around you, it is what vibrates from within you. So loneliness gains another name. It stops being a punishment and becomes an invitation, a gentle call, sometimes painful, but always loving, an invitation to hear what the noise of life did not allow, to feel what distractions covered up, to rediscover in silence the part of yourself that already knew that God was never far away, that God was always enough, even when you didn't feel capable. Even when everything seemed lacking, even when you thought you were alone. What if, This absence that you feel today is, in fact, the space that God left for you to become a co-creator alongside Him, so that you could stop seeking only miracles and start vibrating like a miracle. So that, instead of waiting for the divine to act, you could start vibrating in resonance with Him, as a channel, as a reflection, as a living presence of what is possible when faith stops being a concept and becomes the very frequency of your existence. If you have come this far, something in you has already changed, maybe not with words or with certainties, but with vibration, with presence, with a subtle reminder that what sustains you is not what you have, but what you feel when everything is missing, that what guides you is not what the world approves, but what the soul knows, and that the presence of God, when felt with the whole body, is enough. It does not need to be proven. It does not need to be explained. It only needs to be acknowledged. Every silence you have faced up to this point was not a mistake. It was a bridge. Every absence you lamented was a space. Every pain that seemed unanswered was a call not to the outside, but to the inside. A silent invitation to remember that there is something in you that does not depend on anything. That is already complete. That is already sacred. That already vibrates with the same frequency as the source. The loneliness you felt was God removing the noise. The lack that visited you was God cleaning away the excesses. The time that seemed lost was the exact time for your preparation. And now, perhaps for the first time in a long time, you can listen without rushing, feel without defense, vibrate with truth. Even though everything is still adjusting, you are not the one who was missing. You are the one who remained standing even when everything fell. You are the vibration that remains, the silence that listens, the intention that begins again. You are the bridge between what you feel and what you create, between the invisible that sustains and the visible that manifests. And above all, you are a living reminder that God has never stopped being here. And if this presence touched something in you, then the journey was already worth it, because it is not about understanding everything. It is about feeling the essential, and the essential is this: you have never been alone, not even for a second. And even if the world goes silent, even if everything seems to fail, God is enough. Today, now, in you, with you, like you. And this is just the beginning.